Hi everyone, Mr Tobin here once again, and in this video we're going to be looking at the unseen poetry question on the Leaving Cert English paper. Just before we get into this, I need to let you know that there are two documents linked in the description below that will be helpful for you. First is a poem that I'm going to look at a little later in the video, and the other is a grid, or you might call it a cheat sheet, with all the things that you should be looking for in an unseen poem. Just follow the links to download them, they're completely free. Now, unseen poetry is worth 20 marks, the least amount of marks available for any question on Leaving Cert English paper 1 or 2. And some of you might be thinking, why bother? In fact, you're not alone. The most recent Chief Examiner's report shows that unseen poetry is the worst answered question on the entire paper, with the average mark being just 11 out of 20. And many students don't even bother attempting it at all. But the unseen poetry question represents 5% of your final grade in English. And if you're on that fine line between grades, it's enough to push you into the higher one. That's one reason to take it seriously, but another is that with practice, students can actually do really well in this question. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to get full marks in the unseen poetry question. So, what does the question actually entail? Well, here are some examples from recent years. You're given a poem that you will likely never have seen before, and there will be two questions to choose from. The first question, usually, is a two-parter, with parts A and B being worth 10 marks each, while the second question is a single question worth all 20 marks. You should spend around 20 minutes on this question. And the difference between these two questions is all about guidance and support. The first question is more prescriptive. It's telling you what to look for or what to comment on. The second question is broader, more vague, and allows the student to be more creative in their response. The main reason why I think this question is worth doing is because the mark scheme is so generous. Unlike your single text or your prescribed poetry, where you are expected to know about the text, you're expected to have studied it in detail, and you're expected to be able to write well about it, in the unseen poem, all the pressure is off. You're not expected to know anything about the poet. You're not expected to take any particular angle or interpretation. In fact, the mark scheme explicitly tells examiners that they are not to assume a correct or incorrect response or interpretation, and instead to reward students who engage with the poem itself, the language, its suggestiveness, and its sensuous qualities. This is all language directly from the mark scheme. That's the same guidance, by the way, regardless of whether it's higher or ordinary level. So what does this mean? Well, it's a great opportunity for students because there's 5% of your final grade on offer for a question that you don't have to know anything about beforehand, except the things that I'm going to show you in this video. So what are they? Well, the things that you're going to need to be aware of in unseen poetry, in order from the most straightforward through to the most challenging and difficult, are the literal meaning or message in the poem, the themes, the ideas, and the mood that is created in the poem, language or images that are used, structure or form, and the most challenging, but I think the one that will garner the most marks, the use of sound, rhythm, or even rhyme in the poem. So on my cheat sheet, you can see that I've got a series of questions that you need to ask about the poem to help you get the most out of it. The aim here is to practice using these questions on unseen poems so much that you don't need the cheat sheet at all. These 5 things could also be considered in terms of what would gain you the most marks, as they increase in level from 1 to 5. So for example, while most students would be able to work out the literal meaning of a poem, or as you can see in the question, what's happening in the poem, very few students would be as comfortable talking in detail about the structure or form of a poem in number 4, or even the sound or the rhythm of a poem. So these are the things that differentiate between the grades. I'm going to show you how to use them to interrogate a poem by actually doing it for you with an unseen poem. I'm going to use a Thomas Hardy poem called Neutral Tones. There's a copy of the poem and the question available to download in the description below, and I suggest that if you haven't already, you pause the video now and take a look through it before we start. I'm going to think aloud as I go through the poem using my criteria that you can see on the left hand side, and ideally I'm looking for what I can identify in around 5 to 7 minutes. It's really important to say as well that no one, not even teachers, understand a poem fully after reading it once. There are poems that I've been teaching for 10 years that sometimes surprise me with something new when I hear them read a different way, or when a student brings fresh eyes to them. In the time you have available to you, you don't need to identify absolutely everything. You just need to pick out some key elements and work them into an answer. So let's start. I'm going to read through aloud first, and it's crucial that you do too while you're practicing and learning how to do this. You won't be able to read aloud fully in an exam, so you need to do as much of it as you possibly can beforehand. So Neutral Tones by Thomas Hardy. We stood by a pond that winter day, and the sun was white as though chidden of God, and a few leaves lay on the starving sod. They had fallen from an ash and were grey. Your eyes on me were as eyes that rove over tedious riddles of years ago, and some words played between us to and fro, on which lost the more by our love. The smile on your mouth was the deadest thing, alive enough to have strength to die, and a grin of bitterness swept thereby like an ominous bird a wing. Since then keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrong have shaped to me your face and the God-cursed sun and a tree and a pond edged with greyish leaves. Okay, so just before we start working through our questions on the left hand side, I just want to draw your attention to something in terms of reading poetry. Now, as you can see at the end of some of these lines, we've got punctuation. So we've got a comma or we've got a semicolon. What the punctuation there is doing is slowing you down in your reading. But what you should avoid doing when you're reading poetry is reading just the lines and putting in pauses where there aren't any. So as you can see, there isn't any punctuation at the end of this line, for example, or this line here. So when we have that, we don't pause because it's at the end of a line, we read straight through. So if you're not looking at it printed in front of you and you were just listening to the poem, you mightn't even be able to tell where a line ends and another begins. Now you have to do that to figure out the sound and the rhyme and the rhythm in the poem that we're going to look at later. But just when you're reading poetry for yourself, remember, it's not just about where the line ends, it's about the punctuation. Okay, so the first thing that I look at is the title and that word, neutral. Neutral means in the middle, or a car is in neutral if it's not in gear. And we say neutral colours are those that don't really stand out. It makes me think of greys or light colours that sort of disappear into the background. After my first reading, my initial thought is that this is about a relationship that has somehow gone bad. The speaker is talking to a person he was in a relationship with maybe. I can tell that from the use of we at the beginning, and you and your from stanza 2. So it opens with we and then shifts to your in stanza 2. So it's like sort of a reverse love letter. The speaker is maybe telling his former lover that their breakup by this pond in winter has damaged him in some way. Remember, whether or not this is what the poet intended doesn't matter to us. We've seen that the mark scheme says there's no right or wrong interpretation, so as long as it's justified, we can really say whatever we want. The first step is literal meaning and message, and we can see that it's about a breakup, and the message is one of bitterness, I think. Now I'm using words like maybe and I think and perhaps because as an unseen poem, we can't know anything immediately for definite. There is safety in using words like perhaps or maybe. So as you can see, the first and second steps are quite similar. So now we're at a point where we've a general understanding of the poem. A speaker is addressing his former lover and telling her that their breakup has ruined love for him. Some of the deeper themes we can consider are the idea of pain and love being intertwined maybe. These first two steps are necessary, you have to go through them, but they alone won't secure you very many marks. Almost every student who attempts this question will get to this point. They will have gotten through step 1 and step 2. The next step is to start examining the language that the poet uses in order to convey his message or his ideas and themes. The first stanza established some colour or lack of colour. We have winter, a white sun, the dead grey leaves that had fallen from the ash tree. Now this is a good example of the effectiveness of language. The ash here is an ash tree, but when combined with the word grey, we tend to think of ashes left over after a fire and that grey colour that they produce. So there's an interesting use of language there. The next stanza has a simile, comparing her eyes looking at him to her looking at some annoying riddle or puzzle. The third stanza has some really interesting language that contribute to the idea of negativity. We have contrast between smile and deadest thing, between alive and die in the following line. Also, the bitter grin in this line, perhaps the use of contrast here reflects the separation or the opposite nature of him and his lover. They are so far apart in what they think about love. In the last stanza, we have again the lack of colour from the first stanza and the emphasis of grey in that final line. But what about the structure and form? Well, it's 4 stanzas. Each stanza is a quatrain, and a quatrain is just 4-line chunk. So a 4-line stanza is a quatrain. And so there's a uniformity to it. It looks regular and even. We notice that the ideas expressed in the first stanza are revisited in the last stanza. So we can say that there is a circular or cyclical structure in use. And maybe this reflects the heartbreak that the speaker is experiencing. It's like a vicious cycle that he's stuck in, and like the poem, he keeps coming back to this moment of heartbreak. He can't break out of it. Well, finally, let's take a look at sound, rhythm and rhyme. We can see that there's a fairly regular rhyme scheme. In each stanza, the first and fourth lines rhyme, so day and grey, and the second and third lines rhyme, so God and sod. So we can say that this poem has a rhyme scheme of A, B, B, A. So first line rhymes with the fourth line, and the two middle lines rhyme, so A, B, B, A. Lots of poems have other sorts of rhyme, or no rhyme at all, or words that sort of rhyme, or words within a line that rhyme. But here we have probably one of the most traditional types of rhyme. We call this end rhyme, where the word at the end of a line rhymes with another word at the end of another line. Also with sound, we see that there's alliteration used in stanza 1. We have the starving sod. And assonance in the line, they had fallen from an ash and were grey. Now assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds, so A, E, I, O and U. And we can see here, they had fallen from an ash and were grey. It's almost like it creates this sound where we have to widen our mouth to say the words. Of course, we don't have enough time to go through everything, and ideally you only need to identify one or two key points about the sound. And an interesting one here, I think, comes from the use of rhyme. So the use of rhymes in lines that follow one another helps to build speed. So if we look at stanza 1 again, for example, and the sun was white as though chidden of God, and a few leaves lay on the starving sod. Or even in stanza 2, over tedious riddles of years ago, and some words played between us to and fro. Or stanza 3, alive enough to a strength to die, and a grin of bitterness swept thereby. And when we read those lines in the context of the full stanza, we notice the speed that it creates. So I'm going to read through the first two stanzas, bearing in mind what we said already about not stopping unless there is punctuation. We stood by a pond that winter day, and the sun was white as though chidden of God, and a few leaves lay on the starving sod. They had fallen from an ash and were grey. Your eyes on me were as eyes that rove over tedious riddles of years ago, and some words played between us to and fro, on which lost the more by our love. What we might notice as well here is the use of and. So the two lines rhyming together increases speed, but the use of and also helps in that regard. It's as if the speaker is trying to fit in as much into his argument as possible. It sounds almost childish. If we look at the other stanzas, we see that this is a common feature throughout. We call the repetition of a conjunction, like and, polysyndeton, and that, combined with the way the poet increases the pace of these lines, creates a very deliberate sensation. And this culminates at the end with something interesting. All the lines that begin with and in the poem rhyme with the line either immediately before it or after. So if we look at some of these, so these two lines in stanza 1, and the sun was white and a few leaves lay. So each of these rhymes with each other. So either the line before it or the line after it. And here, this third one rhymes with the line before it. The second rhymes with the line after. This one, and some words played, that rhymes with the line before it. And rhymes with the line before it in terms of the end rhyme. And at the end, we don't have that. So we've got and in this line, but the last line ends in and as well. Our ear becomes accustomed to this. But at the end, it's the last line that doesn't rhyme with the one before it that begins with and it leaves us with a sense of incompleteness, like we're waiting for something else. So to try and pick up that sound, let's read through that again. Since then, keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrong have shaped to me your face in the God-cursed sun on a tree, and a pond edged with greyish leaves. So notice the way that last line hangs, doesn't feel complete or closed. Since then, keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrong have shaped to me your face in the God-cursed sun and a tree, and a pond edged with greyish leaves. If we remember the fact that there appears on the surface to be a uniform and steady structure, this could suggest the difficulty or the unsatisfied nature of the speaker. It's lurking beneath the surface and only really emerges when we read the poem aloud. So looking at the question, we can see that there's quite a lot there to use. I would suggest that if you are struggling to formulate your own ideas about the poem, or you are finding it difficult to unpick the rhythm or the sound, then go for the two-part structured question. But if you can come up with some interesting ideas, then the second question will afford you more freedom and allow you to get the most marks. I wouldn't expect any student to be able to identify these things in a poem they've never seen in 5 to 7 minutes the first time they try it. The idea here is all about practice. So you practice on as many unseen poems as you can, using the guidance in this cheat sheet, using the language that we've talked about to discuss these elements of poetry, and get to the point where you no longer need these questions. They become internalized. I hope that this video has been useful in helping you approach the unseen poetry question. If you would like more videos going through unseen poems in this way, then please let me know in the comments below, or even suggest a poem to analyze. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to leave a comment or a question.